What if I told you Africa is not poor? It is poorly managed. I'm Mayward Martindale, and the business of Africa is my thing. This is a guide for the thinkers, builders, and dreamers shaping Africa's tomorrow, drawn from research, context, history, and lived experience. After decades of independence and countless leadership transitions, why do the outcomes of development remain largely the same? We have seen power change hands across the continent many times. One leader leaves, another takes their place. And with that transition comes renewed hope, new promises, and the expectation of change. Yet more often than not, the lived reality does not shift in any meaningful or lasting way. Not because one person has the power to save a nation, but because leadership, in its truest sense, is not about individuals. It is about what happens to systems when individuals come and go. Leadership is where systems are protected, built, or destroyed. You can change a leader, but if the system remains the same, the outcome rarely changes with it. And in most cases, the system itself is the problem. Designed in a way that concentrates power, limits accountability, and disconnects leadership from consequences. When people say Africa's poor, what they're often reacting to are the visible outcomes of daily life. They're pointing to the unreliable infrastructure, limited economic opportunity, struggling institutions, and the general unpredictability that shapes how people live and plan their futures. That is what poverty looks like on the surface. But those outcomes are not the root problem. They're the result of something deeper. Africa is not lacking in what should produce prosperity. The continent is resource-rich, population-rich, and culturally rich. The issue is not what exists, but how effectively it is managed over time. And management, in this sense, is not just administration. It is the ability to design, maintain, and evolve systems that consistently convert potential into results. To say something is poorly managed is to say that the connection between input and outcome is broken. It means resources do not translate into development. Effort does not compound into progress. Systems are either too weak, too inconsistent, or too dependent on individuals to function effectively over time. This is where leadership becomes critical, not as a status symbol, but as a function. In many cases, leadership transitions across African nations are not moments of continuity, but moments of disruption. Each new administration arrives with its own direction, often disregarding or reshaping what came before it. Policies shift, priorities change, and institutions are forced to adjust, not to long-term national goals, but to short-term political realities. The result is a pattern where progress struggles to accumulate, and instead of building layer upon layer, systems are repeatedly reset. And when systems cannot stabilize, they cannot produce consistent outcomes. Let's examine Singapore. It began not as a nation of abundance. It faced uncertainty, vulnerability, and real constraints. In that moment, many leaders would have responded by either blaming history or outsourcing responsibility. Instead, the approach taken by Lee Kuan Yew was grounded in a clear acceptance of responsibility for survival. Decisions were made that prioritized long-term stability over short-term comfort. Some of these decisions were strict, even uncomfortable, and have often been described as authoritarian. But in this context, what mattered was the outcome they were designed to achieve: a functioning, disciplined state capable of sustaining itself. When a nation is on life support, luxury becomes a comfort it cannot afford. However, the deeper lesson is not simply in the decisiveness of one leader, but in what followed. Leadership in Singapore did not become an exercise in constant reinvention. Successive leaders did not approach governance as an opportunity to start over, make a name for themselves, or to distance themselves from what had been built. Instead, there was continuity in thinking, even as strategies evolved. Systems were allowed to mature. Institutions were strengthened over time. Progress was not interrupted. It was built on brick by brick. This is what happens when leadership rejects failure as an option. In Africa's context, how seriously has survival in its fullest sense been treated? Across the continent, there are recurring patterns that are difficult to ignore. Vision is often present, but systems to support that vision are weak or inconsistent. Power is visible, but accountability is limited. Leadership exists, but discipline in execution is uneven. We talk about development, but often avoid the cost of long-term commitment, trade-offs, and the real human cost it requires. We celebrate independence, but resist institutional maturity. To be fair, leadership in Africa is not simple. Many leaders inherit broken institutions, colonial-era structures, fragile economies, and deeply divided societies. The environment is not just difficult, it is complex. But complexity does not remove responsibility. Mismanagement is not an abstract concept. It is experienced in the daily lives of the people. It shapes the quality of education, the reliability of healthcare, and the availability of jobs, as well as the general sense of whether effort leads to progress. When systems do not function as they should, it is not leaders who absorb the consequences first. It is society, local communities, everyday people looking for the means to live and not just exist. The people have been absorbing this discomfort constantly, repeatedly, often silently. Austerity, inflation, broken infrastructure, unemployment, informality, migration, conflict. The sacrifice has never been evenly shared. So while it is important to speak about discipline, hard decisions, and long-term planning, it is equally important to ask, who bears the cost of those decisions? How are those costs distributed? And who has been asked to sacrifice versus who has been protected from sacrifice? Because development, if it is to be meaningful, cannot exist independently of the people it is meant to serve. Ultimately, the idea that Africa is poor actually oversimplifies the reality. It reduces a complex system-driven issue into a condition that appears natural or inevitable. When viewed more closely, what we see is, in many cases, is a lack of design. Africa is not defined by what it lacks. It is defined increasingly by how what it has is organized, governed, and sustained. Leadership is not about intention. It is not about visibility. It is about the ability to build systems that outlast individuals, that function consistently, and that translate potential into reality over time. And until that becomes the focus, outcomes are unlikely to change, no matter how often leadership does. This is the business of Africa.